Good afternoon. My name is Tina Kepi, and I'd like to welcome you to the Nebraska State Historical's Brown Bag Lecture Series. Lectures are held on the third Thursday of every month in room 303 on the third floor of the City County Building in Lincoln, Nebraska. The building address is 555 South 10th Street. A detailed schedule for the series, as well as information about all of the Historical Society's programs, is available on our website at www.nebraskahistory.org. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to thank the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation for funding the filming of these lectures. Their financial support allows us to tape and broadcast these programs on public access television and on our YouTube webpage. Today's speaker is Nebraska native Melissa Amatisse Marsh. She grew up on a farm near Bridgeport, Nebraska. She holds a bachelor's degree in history from Chadron State College and a master's in history from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Her work has been published in Nebraska History, America in World War II, and several historical encyclopedias. Marsh is an editorial assistant for 2 academic journals published by the Center for Great Plains Studies. She lives in Lincoln with her husband and daughter. Please join me in welcoming Melissa Amatisse Marsh.
Thank you. Thank you to the State Historical Society for asking me here. The person that I really wanted to be here isn't here, and that's Tom Beeker. He passed away in February. I met Tom while I was attending Chadron State College and was able to work with him later when I decided to go back to school and get my master's degree. And Tom was the type of person who had lots of stuff. He had already gone to the archives to get all of the information on the POW camp at Fort Robinson, and all I had to do was make copies. And it was just really a blow to me when he passed away. He was instrumental in helping me write this book, Nebraska POW Camps. But his legacy lives on, and I'd like to think that I'm continuing that by telling a piece of Nebraska history that not many people know about. And those were the POW camps that were here during World War II. About 6 months after America entered the war, the British asked us to help them house 50,000 prisoners of war in June of 1942. We agreed to help, and the U.S. Army immediately created the Prisoner of War Division. They had to decide where to hold the prisoners, grapple with security concerns, and deal with the public reaction. Above all, they had to follow the Geneva Convention of 1929. And they finally hammered out some regulations. It took them a while. But some of the regulations included that camps couldn't be located near war industries or shipyards. They had to be at least 75 miles inland from both coasts and 150 miles in from the Mexican and Canadian borders. Now, putting camps in less populated areas offered more safety, and if there were prisoner escapes, it would be harder for them to head to major cities and like New York or Washington, D.C. and try and sabotage things. There's only 5 states in America that did not have POW camps: Nevada, North Dakota, Rhode Island, Montana, and Vermont. Okay, the Army had several ways to house the prisoners. They used abandoned civilian conservation corps camps, fairgrounds, tent cities, and unused buildings. But they were also built from the ground up. And a camp consisted of 1 or more compounds surrounded by 2 wire fences. Compounds were separated from each other by a single fence. Each compound housed 4 companies of prisoners, or approximately 1,000 prisoners. Each compound included 5 barracks, a latrine with showers and laundry tubs with unlimited hot and cold running water, a mess hall, a recreation building, an infirmary, a workshop, a canteen, and a chapel building. And these features were in accordance with U.S. military regulations and the Geneva Convention. Actually, this was the same type of setup that our soldiers had in their camps. This is a painting done by Thomas Niguel I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. He was an interpreter at Camp Atlanta. This is Camp Atlanta as he painted it. He actually was born in Stuttgart, Germany. He came to the United States in 1940 and was drafted into the Army. And he was sent to be an interpreter at the Atlanta, Nebraska POW camp. And if you ever get down to Holdridge, all of his artwork that he painted while he was here is on display, and you can look at that, and it's really great. This is the POW camp at Scottsbluff. And another view, you can see how close the farms were to the POW camps. This is Fort Robinson. You can see the buttes in the background. And this is a soldier's quarters at the Fort Robinson POW camp, and he's got his pinups, of course. Okay. Now, when the public found out that the German POWs would be coming, they were pretty concerned, and a lot of that was due to the wartime propaganda. We had a lot of imagery like this, and even in the movies too, that showed, you know, these are just evil, bloodthirsty Nazis, and we better watch out. I mean, there's an element of truth to that, of course. But as a general rule, they didn't make a distinction between a German and a Nazi, and there was a difference. Nazism was a political belief, and not every German soldier subscribed to this ideology. So while this kind of lumped all the Germans together, it wasn't really like that, and I'll get into that more in a little bit. The German military machine consisted of men from Germany's allies, Western, Northern, and Eastern European nations, forced conscription, and even prisoners and concentration camp inmates from the Reich. Countries represented in the German army included countries from all of Europe and the Soviet Union. And this created problems, not only in the German army, but when these men were taken prisoners. Now, one of the problems in these camps was that the Americans did not take these fundamental differences in nationalities and ethnicities into consideration. And this and the insidious nature of Nazism within the POW camps themselves would lead directly to the re-education program, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay, in Nebraska, there were 3 base camps. Now, Camp Indianola started out as a base camp. It was switched to a branch camp, and then it went back to base camp and ended as a branch camp. But the 3 main ones were Fort Robinson in northwest Nebraska, Camp Atlanta in central Nebraska, and Camp Scottsbluff in the panhandle of Nebraska, which is about 30 miles from where I grew up. Now, the branch camps are the dots, and we can see there's some in Palisade, Lexington, Kearney, Grand Island, Baird, Bridgeport. Bridgeport's where my hometown. These were called branch camps, and they were set up after we had to address the problem of getting the prisoners to work for the farmers, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. In Nebraska, the first POWs to arrive were Italian, and they came in June 1943 to Camp Scottsbluff. The first group of Germans came in November of 1943. And overall, the German POWs arrived in 3 waves. Okay, these are German officers captured in North Africa. This first group came in 1943 from North Africa and Italy and included Italians and Germans, the most fanatic Nazis, members of the Kriegsmarine, and Erwin Rommel's famous Afrika Korps. The second wave came from northern France after the D-Day invasion of June 6, 1944, and included less elite soldiers. You can see the picture here. These guys don't look too unhappy that they've been captured. They're smiling, they're happy, might be hamming it up for the camera a bit, but I think there was some relief there. The third and final wave came from the winter of 1944 through Germany's defeat in May 1945. These are German POWs taken near Heidelberg. Many of these soldiers were much older or much younger. They were haggard, tired, and more than ready to be done with the war. These are boy soldiers. They were representative of Hitler's army toward the end of the war. A lot of them were Hitler Youth. But fortunately, these boys were not taken, after they were taken prisoner, they were not taken to America. Boys ages 12 to 17, yes, there were soldiers as young as 12 serving in Hitler's army. They were held in a special camp in France. And they called it the baby crib, I think is what it was called. And they tried to re-educate these boys. So after being captured, the men came over on empty troop ships, and they docked in ports at New York and Virginia. They were then put on trains. And once they got on the trains and they were brought into the middle of America, I mean, they were just, some of them were just gobsmacked. They had been told that the mighty Luftwaffe had destroyed American cities. Not true. And they also had no idea that America was so large. Since it took many days for them to get to their destinations, especially Nebraska, they saw plenty of the countryside, and I think they realized that escaping back to Germany was not going to be easy. Here's some soldiers arriving at Fort Robinson. This is the first wave that came through. These are troops from Rommel's Africa Corps. They were Rommel's 10th Panzer Division, and they arrived in Fort Robinson on November 19th, 1943. Sgt Alfred Thompson took these photos, and he wasn't supposed to, but he did anyway. Thank you. Now, when the POWs arrived, they had to go through another round of processing. This included, you know, they checked them for weapons, anything that might be used in an escape attempt, things like that. I do know that one of them had managed to smuggle a Chihuahua in his pocket all the way from Europe, yeah, in North Africa. Now, all aspects of daily life were controlled by the Geneva Convention of 1929. Germany was under this convention. Japan was not. And that's why our soldiers who were taken prisoner by the Japanese were treated so horribly. Now, after they arrived at their assigned camps, they were very surprised to realize they had all the comforts of home. They were well fed, they had clean clothes to wear, showers, a nice comfy bed to sleep in, and a canteen in which they could buy sweets, soda pop, crackers, and other food items, as well as supplies like paper, pens, toothbrushes, things of that nature. They received 10 cents a day to purchase these items, and it was in the form of canteen coupons. I have a picture of those in a minute. And then if they went to work, they received an additional 80 cents a day. They also had a lot of things to keep them busy. Their favorite game to play was soccer, of course, though the Italian POWs in Scottsbluff preferred to play volleyball and bocce ball. Here's the Italian POWs in Scottsbluff playing volleyball, and you'll see there's a dog there. There's a lot of pictures that I found in my research of POWs with mascots. They're camp mascots, and they were dogs usually. They read books, they drew, they painted, they carved wood, and handcrafted all sorts of objects. And here are a few from the Fort Robinson POW camp. Oh, they're playing bocce ball right there. This is a ship made by a German POW at Fort Robinson on display at the museum there. This one is on display at the Holdridge Museum, and it is this was in Atlanta. It's a German naval vessel constructed from scrap wood. Also, another favorite pastime was watching Hollywood movies. They took classes such as math and economics and the English language, and they kept busy working around the camps. The POWs at Camp Atlanta had a garden so big that it took 20 POWs to maintain it. They shared their surplus of food with nearby branch camps. At Fort Robinson, many of the men worked around the fort, and they helped with the canine dogs that were being trained for war. They worked in the veterinary clinic for the horses, and they did groundskeeping. At other camps, they worked in the kitchens and bakeries or did maintenance. Here are some POW cooks at Fort Robinson. This is the orchestra at Camp Atlanta. They actually were able to organize bands and orchestras. They were very, very active in theater and music. These orchestras were very popular, and they often gave performances not only to the POWs, but to the townsfolk nearby. They built elaborate sets and costumes. They put on plays, and at times even musicals. And this is one of my favorite pictures because, as we know, there was no women in these POW camps, but there were parts that needed to be played by women, so they dressed up. And this was taken at Camp Atlanta. This is the theater at Fort Robinson. They called it Varista, which meant variety in barbed wire. And the YMCA and residents from local communities often donated items to the POWs like musical instruments, sports equipment, books, board games, and more. And they also had freedom of religion, and they had Catholic and Lutheran services held every Sunday. So after looking, hearing all this, we're assuming, hey, they had it great here, and really they did. But we needed to keep them busy. So they had little time to think about escaping or causing mischief. And two, the Army had to follow the Geneva Convention, and some of these things were required. And if we didn't follow it, it would mean trouble for our boys held by the Germans in Europe. Now, there were no successful escapes from any Nebraska POW camp, although when I was in Kearney, somebody told me that they had heard of one that did escape, but I can't confirm that. So, no successful escapes from any Nebraska POW camp that I have on record. Hogan, Colonel Klink. This is one of my favorite shows. We have the entire season on DVD. My 15-year-old daughter loves it. So, anyway, Hogan and his boys knew the truth. Yeah, they had some pretty successful escapes. Now I want to talk about the labor program, and this was one of the most fun and interesting aspects to research because I received a lot of personal stories from people. And most people who contacted me did so because they remembered the prisoners coming to their farms and working. And not one person that I talked to said they had trouble with them. And now I know that they had to be, instances of mischief and perhaps danger, but I haven't run across any. But for the majority of them, they were happy to be out of the camps and working because, when you're inside day after day, you start going a little stir crazy. This is a sign at Camp Scottsbluff. The safety pays, number of days worked without a lost time accident. The military only had 7. And then the civilian had 38, POWs 8. When we decided to begin using POWs as laborers, there was a fair amount of resistance because we had a lot of questions we needed to figure out. But the reality was we needed to figure out because we needed the labor. Crops were beginning, we needed to harvest the crops. That was the biggest hit that all of our soldiers leaving had left behind was the agricultural sector. So we desperately needed the labor. And there was a shortage of manpower. We had high school kids go out and harvest the beets. Women, migrant laborers came up from Central America and Mexico. And this helped some, but it didn't do enough. So the government finally got everything squared away, and it got underway in the fall of 1943. Now, business leaders in nearby communities could petition the War Department for their labor needs. They had to jump through a lot of hoops to get POW labor, but this was as much for their protection as it was for the protection of American POWs in Europe. Again, they had to follow the Geneva Convention. And work could not be related to any war operations. It could not be unhealthy, dangerous, or degrading. So here's an example of how the program worked. If a farmer needed help, he had to contact his local county extension agent, get a certificate of need, and then give the application to the state or regional War Manpower Commission director. We were in the 7th Service Command, and then this service command would then determine the requirements for suitable housing, transportation, sanitation, security, all at the site of the project, and whether POW labor would be properly employed. These are German POWs working near Belfouche, South Dakota, and this was a branch camp of Fort Robinson. And this was, what most of the POWs in Nebraska were used for was agricultural labor. Now, if the farmer survived this lengthy process of certificates and all that stuff, he'd be notified of his approval, and then he would head to camp to pick him up. Now, a guard accompanied the prisoners, and in the beginning, there was probably about as many guards as there were prisoners, because these guys were battle-hardened men. They didn't know what was going to happen when we let them out into the fields. You know, what are they going to do? But after a while, it became very lax, the security did. And often I've heard countless stories of the guard sleeping against the tree while, you know, the POWs work. One of my favorite stories is there was a pretty big sergeant trying to get into the back of the pickup, and he couldn't get it, so he handed his gun to a prisoner. They hauled him up, and then the prisoner handed him his gun back. That just shows the level of trust between them. Also, there was a lot of trust between the farm families and the prisoners. Now, I think a large part of this is because there is a very heavy German immigrant population in Nebraska. There was a lot of Germans, you know, like in the Panhandle of Scottsbluff, the Germans from Russia. My grandmother's a German from Russia. They didn't have they didn't have laborers on her farm, but my grandfather, who was Italian, did. He went to Bridgeport and picked up the Italians. They were at the Bridgeport Fairgrounds and brought them back, and they could talk to each other in the same way the German, you know, families could talk to their prisoners. But what's interesting is that my great-grandfather was not technically a citizen. He was an enemy alien, and they actually confiscated his shortwave radio. But he was able to get Italian POWs to work for him, but he couldn't have a shortwave radio. So, because he might contact his relatives back in Italy, although I don't know what about. So, there's no doubt that with the help of the German and Italian POWs in Nebraska, the harvest was saved. And that was true for around the country. I know there were some that worked in the apple orchards in Nebraska City, and also along the East Coast. They were helping in the fruit harvesting. Now, officers were not required to work. Enlisted men were. And they were paid 80 cents a day, and these were paid in canteen coupons. They got a booklet like this. This is from Scottsbluff. And then they got these little 1 cent, 5 cent, 10 cent. This is a Fort Robinson one that they could use to purchase things at the canteen. And this is from Camp Atlanta. So it was a pretty successful program. I have Arnold Kramer. He's kind of the father of the research on this. He wrote Nazi Prisoners of War in America, and he said this was overall a very successful program. Not very many problems. Although I did uncover one instance here in Nebraska where the Geneva Convention was probably violated. Does anybody recognize this picture?
Rosie the Riveter.
Yes, but in Grand Island. This was the Cornhusker Labor Detachment, the Cornhusker Ordnance Plant, where they built bombs. The camp was specifically called the Cornhusker Labor Detachment. Its location on reports was given as Hall County, not Grand Island. And the local media didn't report on the true nature of the camp. But one German POW, Sebastian Joker, knew exactly how his work would impact the war. This is funny. Okay, he said, we were sitting there in camp and a guy asked me, he was writing a letter home, and he said to me, what should I write what I work for, what I'm doing here in America? I said, write that you are working for an eraser company. Eraser, he asked. Yeah, I said, an eraser company to wipe out German cities. Now, they didn't make the, connect the dots, so to speak, until he told them this, and all of a sudden they were like, whoa, we're not going to do this. So they went on strike, but if you didn't work, you didn't get food. That was one of the things they put into place, and eventually a few days later, they, were hungry, so they decided, we'll keep on building bombs. So, yeah, that's pretty much a violation of the Geneva Convention, but no one really made a fuss. Now, to make sure the camps were following the Geneva Convention, the International Red Cross and a representative of the War Department sent out inspectors, and the YMCA did the same. And this was kind of the bread and butter of my research, these inspection reports. Unfortunately, a lot of them were lost, destroyed. So the ones for the branch camps are very few and far in between, which is unfortunate. But it would go through each, this one, you know, talks about the hospital, talks about the quarters, it went through the religion, everything, and just broke down how things were going in the camp. Now, so far, I've painted a fairly ideal picture for you of the POW's life here in America, and to a certain extent, it was ideal. When soldiers would receive packages of food from their family in Germany, they'd write back and they'd say, "Don't send me anymore. I had more than enough. You need this." Of course, this was a lot better than what, you know, how they could have been treated in Soviet prisoner of war camps. And we know what happened. A lot of them were killed. But unfortunately, many Americans saw how well the POWs were treated, and they got upset. And they started calling these places the Fritz Ritz, which is the title of my talk. And it became so bad that the government launched an investigation. But as it turned out, the results concluded that the prisoners weren't being pampered. Still, it was hard to turn the tide of public opinion. But there was one aspect to their lives that wasn't roses, wasn't all roses. It could be downright dangerous, and it had nothing to do with the U.S. Army. It had everything to do with Nazism. This is just one example of many of Hitler's reign of terror. Arnold Kramer says this about, now this is what I was alluding to earlier, that not every German soldier was a Nazi. The average German soldier, and thus the average German prisoner of war in the U.S., was not a fanatical ideologue. He was a nationalist, to be sure, and in large measure wholly captivated by the mystique and omnipotence of Hitler's leadership. But there were wide differences among them. Some prisoners were professional soldiers, while others were wartime conscripts. They represented different units and had fought in different campaigns. The circumstances surrounding their capture may have varied widely. In addition to the German prisoners, there were Austrians, Poles, Hungarians, Yugoslavs, and Russians. Some were party members, but most were not. And that's key. So in the camps themselves, we had Nazis, very, very, big Nazis, and anti-Nazis. So how could there not be trouble with these two groups bumping up against each other? This became a national problem in the camps, and there's a few incidents here in Nebraska that I wanted to focus on. Unfortunately, the truth was Americans wanted camps that were well ordered and disciplined, and allowing Nazis to be in charge within the compounds practically guaranteed this. Now remember, these guys were soldiers. They were still very disciplined and orderly, and the camp spokesman was one who was elected by the other POWs to speak on behalf of the POWs to the U.S. Army. And he was usually a Nazi. Now, this was true at Fort Robinson, where Harry Hohenmude was the camp spokesman. And I've asked some of my friends in Germany about that name, and the last name is Murder. So that's just kind of an ironic touch there. Now, here's a few examples of how the Nazism infiltrated the ranks. Here it is. Found this in the New York Times today. A German prisoner of war at the camp at Scottsbluff, Nebraska, who wanted to write to his father, a resident of the United States, was severely beaten Friday night by fellow prisoners who declared the father was not a good Nazi. The prisoner was a member of a group captured near Cherbourg. 2 or 3 of the other prisoners told him that he couldn't write his father because the father was not a good Nazi, the Army said. But the prisoner insisted on writing and was beaten so badly he was taken to the camp hospital. That's just one example. Another one, a prisoner was put into protective custody because his life had been threatened. And his crime? He had read and translated American newspapers for other prisoners, and many called him a traitor. And he was transferred to Camp Ruston, Louisiana. At Fort Robinson, one prisoner made anti-Nazi statements in the camp, and the camp spokesman, Harry Hohenmutter, heard it, and he said that Ludwig at dinner time used in the mess hall the following sentence directed to his comrades: "If we win the war, I will never return to Germany. If we lose it, I will deliver the Nazis to the knife." Now, Hohenmutter went on to explain that Ludwig's transfer out of the camp would be in the interest of good order and discipline among the German soldiers in this camp. And the U.S. Army camp commander, Colonel Blaine, agreed, stating that Ludwig's continued presence in this camp is considered dangerous to himself. And he was in protective custody to prevent harm from befalling him at the hands of the other prisoners. He was authorized to be transferred to a camp in Mississippi, and he left 4 days after the incident was reported, so they got him out of there in a hurry. Other serious issues occurred: kangaroo courts, forced suicides, threats of violence, beatings, and intimidation. This was happening all across the United States. Eventually, the public once again took notice. Now, the initial way to handle this was transfer and separate the Nazis and the anti-Nazis. But it was pretty clear that this wasn't going to work. Now, the War Department had recognized the need to break this grip of Nazism pretty early in March of 1943. And they wanted to re-educate them. And the upper Army brass said that the goal of an education would be so that prisoners of war might be exposed to the facts of American history, the workings of a democracy, and the contributions made to America by peoples of all national origins. But the Major General at the time thought it was unwise. He's like, these guys are not kids. This is interesting. Those who have sufficient intellectual capacity to be of value to a post-war world have already built the philosophical frameworks of their respective lives. Those whose minds are sufficiently plastic to be affected by the program are probably not worth the effort. So we put this plan away in June of 1943. But the stories continued to emerge on the violence in the camps, and the public became frustrated at the lack of government action. And it went all the way up to Mrs. Roosevelt. She talked to her husband, and then her husband talked to the Secretaries of War and State. And that's when they brought back the plan, and it was called the Denazification Program. Now, what was this program? In layman's terms, it tried to undo the damage of Hitler's brainwashing. Now, this is the official statement outlining the program's goals. The prisoners would be given facts, objectively presented, but so selected and assembled as to correct misinformation and prejudice surviving Nazi conditioning. The facts, rather than being forced upon them, would be made available through such medias as literature, motion pictures, newspapers, music, art, and educational courses. Two types of facts were needed: those which would convince them of the impracticality and viciousness of the Nazi position. If a large variety of facts could be presented convincingly, perhaps the German prisoners of war might understand and believe historical and ethical truth as generally conceived by Western civilization, might come to respect the American people and their ideological values, and upon repatriation to Germany, might form the nucleus of a new German ideology which will reject militarism and totalitarian controls and will advocate a democratic system of government. That's a lofty goal. It's a worthy goal. Whether it worked or not, we'll talk about in a minute. There was one little problem with the re-education program, and that came with the Geneva Convention again. It prohibited prisoners of war from being subjected to propaganda. If the Germans found out that their men were being given heavy doses of education on American democracy, there was nothing to stop them from teaching American POWs about Nazism. So we kind of did this little sidestep thing, and we went to the loophole in the Geneva Convention in Article 17 that stated, "So far as possible, belligerents shall encourage intellectual diversions and sports organized by prisoners of war." So the official name was the Intellectual Diversion Program. I did a lot of my master's thesis on the re-education program at Fort Robinson, largely thanks to two men who gave me wonderful resources. Wolfgang Dorst, he was the camp translator, and later, after Harry Hohenmuller was ousted, he became the camp spokesman at Fort Robinson POW camp. He was a veteran of the 10th Panzer Division, entered the Army at the age of 28 in June 1940, and fought in Russia and North Africa as part of a motorcycle reconnaissance unit, captured on May 13th, and he arrived with the 1st Afrika Korps prisoners at Fort Robinson in late 1943. He was anti-Nazi. His father was a Nazi. Wolfgang wasn't. And then the second, and he had a diary that he kept while he was at Fort Robinson. And thanks to Tom, he had already had someone translate it. So by the time I got there, it was already translated to English. And it was wonderful to read. This is Sgt Alfred Thompson. Before the war, he was a high school German teacher in North Dakota. He became first an intelligence officer at Fort Robinson and later the assistant executive officer of the re-education program. And he wrote several letters to his parents and his brother while he was stationed at Fort Robinson. And they're beautifully written. He had a way with words, and he wrote about the re-education program a lot. And those are in the archives of the State Historical Society if you're ever interested. Now, when the program officially started in November of 1944, he had already started educational courses. And Dorschel, who already spoke English, had been taking advantage of these classes. But when the new re-education program came along, the course offerings changed. Now they had classes in American history, American government, things of that nature. And Thompson wrote that over 2,000 POWs were enrolled in the classes. Now this was nationwide. This wasn't just in Nebraska. I don't have any photos of POWs in Nebraska studying, but this is from Florida, and they're studying English here. You notice they all have the PW on their shirts. They also had it on their pants. They had P on one leg and W on the other, and that was nationwide as well. Now, one great thing about Wolfgang Dorst is before the war ended, he actually started his own group, and it was called the Working Association for Political Enlightenment. It was a secret group, but he wanted other anti-Nazi people to gather together so they could talk about how they could change the narrative in the camp. Now, with Dorschel at the helm, 20 German POWs, all of them progressive anti-Nazis, met secretly for months to lay the groundwork for their democratic program. To belong to the group, you had to take an oath to break totally and completely with National Socialism. Now, in July of 1945, by which time Hitler was defeated and the intellectual diversion program was no longer a secret, nearly 90% of the POWs in Fort Robinson were members of Dorschel's group. And they were instrumental in giving lectures to discuss the future of Germany and the country's past. But most importantly, now they could speak openly and freely without fear of being beaten up. Now, these lectures, in conjunction with classes like American history, were highly popular. But another way of re-educating the POWs was through the use of film. Hollywood war films, which there were many. This is the Fighting Sullivans, and this was based on the 5 Sullivan brothers who were all killed on board ship during the Battle of Guadalcanal. Another one that they showed was Frank Capra's Why We Fight series, and they made quite a deep impression on the POWs. But there was one film, now these films were not mandatory to go to, but there was one film after the end of the war that was, and that was the Nazi atrocity films of the concentration camps. They decided that, the Army decided that these atrocity films could be used as a lesson in collective guilt, as well as a tool of re-education. prisoners at Fort Robinson, I'm not sure where this was taken, it's not at Fort Robinson, they watched it on July 31st, 1945. And in Dorschel's diary, he wrote, showing a film from a concentration camp. The film made a deep impression on the PWs. But unfortunately, the Nazi ideology ran pretty deep for some of these men. And some prisoners refused to believe what they were seeing. And they were convinced the bodies of the Jews killed by the Nazis were, in actuality, India natives killed by the British in India. And unfortunately, we still have Holocaust deniers today. This is not a new phenomenon. So now we come to the question, how successful was the intellectual diversion program? The short answer, we don't really know. And that's because there were no studies done. We didn't send a team of people over to Germany to interview people or anything like that. Partly that was because the Korean War came very fast. The Cold War, the Berlin Wall, all of those things, the division of East and West Germany. And this whole POW experience was kind of shoved to the back burner. That's why not many people, when I talked to a historian the other day and he said, I didn't even know we had POW camps in Nebraska. It's kind of been lost. But I think there were some men who truly did benefit from this program. Wolfgang Dorst was one of them. He truly believed in democratic ideals, and he was determined to share his knowledge with others in order to help create a new Germany. He actually went to South Dakota, where the presidents are, Mount Rushmore, and he said it was a shrine of democracy for him. So here was one that really did benefit from the program. Of course, he was anti-Nazi to begin with. If we really wanted to determine the success, we would have to go to some of those who were really, hardcore Nazis and see if it made a difference. Unfortunately, we don't know. But Alfred Thompson felt very good about what they had done there. I feel that I have won a great battle, he said, that I have proved myself capable of beating a task which I oftentimes thought was impossible to whip. It has not been a fight in which the laurels gained at the end are pinned on one's chest, nor is it a fight in which one gains a bankroll. It is a fight to prove the worth of man, to prove that there is an intrinsic, inborn, God-given worth to every person, and that even the demoniac teachings of a Hitler cannot destroy that worth, and that if one practices what he preaches, he can regain that which others claim has been lost for all times. That's just a sampling of how beautifully he writes, and he really believed in this program, and he put his whole heart and soul into it, and I really think it did make a difference. Fort Robinson was known nationally as one of the best camps for the re-education program. So after the war ended, it took the German prisoners some time before they were repatriated back to Germany. And actually, there were farmers who were frantic, don't send them back yet, we need them. And so a lot of them didn't go back until 1946. But some of them who did go back, they did not have much to go back to. This is a boy who has returned and found that his home has been gone, there's nothing left. A lot of the prisoners who went back, they actually wrote back to people they had worked for in Nebraska, asking for help. We responded. We sent them packages. And also, there were some that did have happy moments. I had to include this because there were reunions. This is a German soldier who reunites with his wife in Germany. What happened to the camps and the prisoners when the war ended? Well, the camps were torn down. There is one camp that is still going. You can go visit it. It's in Texas, though. As far as in Nebraska, you can see the foundations of the camp at Fort Robinson, but that's about it. The camp at Scottsbluff is out by the airport. That's all been torn down. A lot of the buildings, because, things were in such short supply, people would buy the buildings and they'd move them to their farms or their, town businesses. They'd take the wood for scrap, whatever. And then at Camp Atlanta, this is, you can see the smokestack in the background. That's pretty much all that's left of Camp Atlanta. And then this marks the location out at Fort Robinson. The POW camp, if you've been to Fort Robinson, it's not actually, right next to the fort. It's a couple miles away from it. So, what is Nebraska's legacy of the POW camps? Well, this is my best clue, that it was a good one, because many former German POWs came back. A lot of them had to have sponsors, so every German POW had to go back to Europe. Unfortunately, some of them ended up in France, and some of them died. There was a whole issue with that, with them being used as slave labor almost. But some of them ended up, they came back here. And a lot of them actually came back for reunions. Wolfgang Dorst came back 2 or 3 times. Him and Tom Baker became very good friends. And there's several that are in the panhandle of Nebraska that they came back and they settled and they stayed here the rest of their lives. They loved it. They had nothing but good things to say about their treatment here. So I would have to say that we truly lived up to our state motto, which is the good life. And here's a monument at Camp Atlanta. German prisoner of war camp where enemies became friends. And I think that is a fitting conclusion, because a lot of them, they became friends. They came back, they visited, and there was no bitterness between them. It was just a good experience all around for most of them. And I hope to keep doing research in this, because more needs to be done, and this history needs to be kept alive, and I hope I've brought it to life for you today. Thank you. Any questions?
I have 2 I'd like to ask.
Okay.
One is that I used to see POWs out on the farm, see them at the movies in Franklin. I grew up close to Franklin. And see them at the movies on Saturday night. I never saw any guards
Really? Okay, he said that he used to see some of them out
on the farm.
and at the movie theater, and he never saw any guards.
Actually, I knew one of the people that was supposed to be, I guess he was a guard. He drove the van to bring them to the movies.
Yeah.
But then they just let them go to the movies and didn't pay. They brought them into the movie house together.
Mm-hmm.
But then they didn't guard them in
Right.
any way.
And he said that they brought them into the movie house but didn't guard them. I think that's pretty typical. They trusted him that much. And also, there were some escapes, but they didn't make it very far. Because they got out there and like, oh, I'm in the middle of a field. Where am I going to go? So, yeah, that was very typical. And actually, Arnold Kramer is actually working on a new book about the fraternization between the guards and local women. There were romances that bloomed. Some soldiers would sneak out just so they could go find a woman, and there was little romances going on. So I think that's very typical.
Okay. The other question I had was, are there official records available of the POWs, the people that were in the camps and what camps they were in?
Okay, he asked if there's official records of where the German POWs were held in the camps. Actually, all of their records were shipped to Germany. So I've had several people ask me, was this, my grandfather was in a camp, could you find out? You actually have to go to Germany and into their military archives. And they have done they've probably done more research into this than American historians have done.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes?
A number of them came back after the war. How many? Can you give us some idea?
Okay, he asked how many came back after the war. For Nebraska, I'd say around 50, maybe more. Nationally, I don't know. But there was quite a few. And I wish, that's one of the frustrations of doing this topic, is a lot of the records were destroyed. The military, they have things in triplicate almost. But they, after the war was over, they got rid of so much. And a lot of this stuff is just gone. It would be interesting. I would love to research how many came back, but I don't know for sure. But there was quite a few in Nebraska. Yes?
Your map showed many branch
Mm-hmm.
camps.
Yes.
were they associated then with one of the three major
Yes.
camps?
Yes.
For instance, the one in Grand Island, perhaps associated with
Atlanta, yes, that's correct, yes. He asked if the branch camps were associated with one of the base camps, and yes. For example, I think Camp Atlanta had like 8 or 9 branch camps, and so the main administration was done at the base camp. But then the prisoners, they actually lived in the branch camps. Like I said, in Bridgeport, it was the fairgrounds. But they had everything, you know, most everything. Some of the branch camps didn't have everything like the bigger ones did. It was kind of hit and miss. Some of them were just, you know, out in the middle of a field almost, and they didn't have much to do. But they were temporary. Yes.
When I was a child, I remember being told that the one in Grand Island was a former high school,
Yes.
which is in Grand Island across the street from the Liederkranz Hotel, Liederkranz German Club, High German Club. Then that high school, after it served its purpose as a camp, was torn down, and I believe it's still a vacant lot.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. He said that in Grand Island, the camp was actually a building in town. And that's true. There was a lot of them that were. I know in Lyman, Nebraska, it was the old dormitories of the Western Sugar Beet Company that they lived in. So it wasn't always that they built the camp from the ground up, but they used existing structures a lot of the times. Yes.
Might be of interest that one of the barracks at Franklin was purchased by a farmer. Now it serves as part of the Lions Club building in Macon.
Really? Yeah.
In Macon, Nebraska.
He said that one of the barracks in Franklin was purchased by a farmer, and it's now being used
As part of the Lions Club building.
as
in
part of the
in
Lions
Macon.
Club building in Macon. Yeah, that happened a lot. They bought buildings and they took them away, and it's kind of sad for me because, you know, in historic preservation, I really wish it all, but it was wartime and we had, you know, we needed those things, and we didn't sometimes think about preserving things for the future. Yes?
So you mentioned earlier about that some of them did escape. What happened, what was the process when they recaptured prisoner of war?
Okay. He asked what was the process of those who did escape and they were recaptured. Sometimes they were punished, or sometimes they were actually transferred to another camp. I do know that there were 2 men who escaped from Scottsbluff and made it all the way to Philadelphia. How they got there, I don't know. I would love to follow up on that because that's quite a trip. But they were captured and they were transferred to another camp. So I think it was just, you know, it depends on how far they got. There were some that they caught him the next day, and they just, you know, they brought him back to the camp and they put him in, you know, solitary confinement for a while, but nothing real bad. You know, no firing squad or anything like that.
I have a couple of thoughts. One is, a dear friend of mine told me he remembers as a 6, 7-year-old kid, he lived across the street from Camp Indianola. And he remembered the guy was just part of the family.
Yes.
There were a couple of them that lived there. The other side to it is that was his dad's farmland across the street. And the taking of the land, it happened to be wonderfully good farmland.
Yeah.
And apparently there's a side story to this about the way the government had taken the land and what they were paid for it.
Yeah.
And apparently it wasn't all positive.
Yeah, he's talking about how the government sometimes took land away from farmers, and it was good ground to build the camps. And this was true. I did run across a few people, I think one from Bridgeport, they actually bought some of their land. And yeah, that was, you know, there was people that were up in arms over where to put the camps because, you know, I know there was a big town hall meeting in Lyman saying, we don't want them here. But when they realized that, hey, yeah, we need them here because of the labor shortage, they kind of just went along with it.
I
Yes.
might tell you also that I was squirrel hunting out on the farm, and I made some of the POWs very uneasy.
Did you?
I was carrying a .22 rifle with me, and
He said he was out squirrel hunting and he was carrying a .22 rifle with him and he made the POWs uneasy. Well, I can understand why. There's one story where a guy came home, he was a kid, and he came home and he heard this shotgun blast and he thought, oh my gosh, what's going on? Well, they were harvesting potatoes and the potatoes were rotten and they were taking turns doing target practice. The POWs were. They were shooting it, you know, with the farmer. That's the level of trust that they had. Another one wanted to go hunting for some pheasant. So the farmer gave him a shotgun. He went hunting, came back with the pheasant with, you know, some tail feathers sticking out of his hat. That's just how trustful they were. Now, I know there was a bad side to it, which I talked about, but overall, I have not heard any stories, and I've, you know, talked to several groups with lots of people talking to me about stories like yours. And it's just a very good memory for them. They didn't have any problems.
Another thing comes to mind is that I've always heard the story that you could feed the POWs, but you were not to have them in the house.
Yes.
And I've been to some family dinners with the POWs, and they were always fed on the porch.
Yes. Yeah, he was saying that there was a regulation that POWs were not to eat with the families. And you had, you fed them on the porch, right? There were other ones that actually brought them inside to the table. They didn't care. They're like, there was one German farmer who said, let them come get me if they have a problem with it. You know, but they didn't. And there was one lady in my book who, she made strawberry shortcake for him every day. So it was just this really good experience for a lot of people. I think that's it. Do you have one more?
Did America have Japanese POW?
We had only, except for the internment of Japanese Americans, we only had a few Japanese POWs. Just a few, because of course surrendering for the Japanese was not honorable. So there was just a few of them in America. And they were, I'm not sure, they weren't held in the same camps, I don't think. Yes?
Were there any marriages between the German POWs and the American girls?
She asked if there was any marriages, and I'm sure that there were. They actually they came back. After they had gone to Germany, they came back and yeah, they married. I've run across a few of those stories. So that's always kind of fun. I think that's it for today. Thank you so much for coming. Appreciate it.